The next financial crisis may not start because money disappears. It may start because the world slowly becomes dependent on financial infrastructure controlled by systems nobody can easily disconnect from anymore. And once enough governments, central banks, private payment networks, and global financial institutions all begin competing for influence over the same settlement rails simultaneously, the issue may no longer be who built the fastest system. The issue may become who controls access to the infrastructure the financial world can no longer operate without. And the dangerous part is that most people may not realize the dependency is forming until leaving those systems becomes economically painful, operationally disruptive, or strategically dangerous. That changes the entire conversation around stablecoins, the XRP ledger, blockchain settlement systems, and global liquidity itself, because once enough financial activity becomes dependent on the same settlement infrastructure repeatedly, the entities controlling those systems may eventually gain enormous influence over who gets access, which economies remain connected, which systems become isolated during geopolitical conflict, and which financial networks the world becomes dependent on long-term. That is where this conversation becomes much bigger than crypto speculation, because most people still imagine digital finance as a technology race, where better systems naturally replace slower systems over time. But historically, financial infrastructure has never been only about efficiency. Financial infrastructure has always been tied to power, influence, sanctions capability, liquidity access, monetary control, geopolitical leverage, and strategic dependency. And once enough value begins moving through the same infrastructure repeatedly, the operators of those systems may eventually gain enormous influence over how global liquidity itself functions underneath the financial system. That is the part almost nobody is fully thinking through yet. Because if digital settlement infrastructure eventually becomes the operational foundation underneath global finance itself, then the system's governments, institutions, and corporations become dependent on may eventually shape monetary power for decades. And this is where the XRP ledger and XRP coin distinction becomes critically important again, because infrastructure adoption alone still does not automatically force XRP coin itself to become structurally required underneath the system. That distinction still matters. The XRP ledger can continue growing institutionally, while XRP coin itself still remains optional across many settlement flows. And that means infrastructure growth alone does not automatically guarantee long-term XRP coin dependency, but this is also where the deeper liquidity problem underneath global finance starts becoming much more important. Because once multiple governments, central banks, banking systems, payment providers, and private financial networks all begin competing for influence over settlement infrastructure globally, fragmentation pressure may actually become even more complicated over time, instead of simpler. That is the hidden issue forming underneath the system. Most people still imagine global finance eventually converging into one unified framework, but the real world may not evolve that cleanly. One government may not want its economy routed through infrastructure controlled by geopolitical rivals. One central bank may resist private stablecoin systems gaining influence over settlement activity. One region may attempt to reduce exposure to foreign-controlled payment rails entirely. Private financial networks may compete directly against government-backed systems for liquidity influence globally, and once that happens, interoperability may become one of the most strategically important problems in global finance. Because if the world eventually becomes divided across multiple competing financial systems, then moving liquidity efficiently between those systems may become far more difficult than most people currently realize. And this is where the bridge asset conversation potentially changes completely, because once competing financial powers stop fully trusting each other's systems, neutral liquidity movement between disconnected networks may become far more strategically important later in the cycle. That is a very different problem than most XRP holders are currently focused on, because right now most people are still asking whether banks are using blockchain technology, whether institutions are testing stable coins, or whether settlement systems are becoming faster. But the deeper issue may eventually become what happens when multiple competing financial powers all begin building systems they want the rest of the world to depend on simultaneously. That changes everything. Because infrastructure dependency creates leverage. The more value routed through a system repeatedly, the more influence the operators of that system potentially gain over liquidity access, settlement permissions, compliance standards, transaction visibility, reserve management structures, and operational participation itself. That is how infrastructure power historically evolves, and once systems become deeply embedded into global commerce, disconnecting from them can eventually become economically painful, operationally disruptive, or strategically dangerous. That is why infrastructure control matters so much, because once enough institutions, governments, and liquidity providers become dependent on the same settlement systems long enough, those systems may slowly begin shaping the rules underneath global finance itself. And this is where the future battle may become much more dangerous than many people currently expect, because governments may not want rival powers controlling the rails their economies depend on. Private financial institutions may not want governments fully controlling settlement visibility. Central banks may not want private corporations controlling cross-border liquidity movement. Entire regions may attempt to reduce exposure to foreign-controlled settlement infrastructure completely. And if rival financial powers stop trusting each other's systems deeply enough, the world may eventually begin splitting into competing liquidity networks, operating under different political, regulatory, and financial interests simultaneously. That is where the situation becomes much more unstable. Because once liquidity starts fragmenting across competing financial systems globally, moving value between those systems efficiently, neutrally, and reliably may become one of the biggest operational challenges in digital finance itself. That fragmentation could increase the importance of interoperability dramatically, and this is where bridge asset conversations potentially become much more strategically relevant later in the cycle. Because bridge assets are not primarily about replacing national currencies emotionally or ideologically. They are about reducing the operational burden of fragmented liquidity systems existing across disconnected financial networks. That is the deeper issue most people still are not fully connecting yet. And this is why the XRP ledger and XRP coin distinction still matters so much inside this series, because the XRP ledger can support institutional settlement infrastructure growth, while XRP coin itself still remains optional in many flows unless larger liquidity pressures eventually begin forcing systems toward deeper interoperability optimization later. That is the key. The long-term question may not simply be whether blockchain adoption grows. The long-term question may become whether fragmented financial systems eventually create enough liquidity complexity that neutral bridge mechanisms become increasingly difficult to avoid operationally. Because if global finance eventually becomes divided across competing infrastructure blocks, then systems capable of helping liquidity move efficiently between those blocks may become strategically important under the right conditions. That is where the bridge asset thesis potentially changes entirely. Not through hype, not through headlines, not through community belief, through fragmentation pressure. Because systems under pressure do not optimize for ideology. They optimize for survivability, interoperability, liquidity efficiency, and operational stability. And if competing financial systems continue forming globally, while liquidity fragmentation pressure keeps increasing underneath the system, then bridge assets capable of reducing operational friction between disconnected financial networks may eventually become much harder to ignore later in the cycle. That is the shift most people still cannot see clearly yet. Because the future battle may not simply be about which blockchain grows the fastest anymore. The future battle may become about who controls liquidity movement between competing financial systems globally, who controls interoperability standards, who controls settlement access, and whether the world eventually converges around open interoperability or fragmented infrastructure dependency instead. And if that battle continues intensifying globally over time, the systems capable of helping liquidity move across disconnected financial ecosystems efficiently may eventually become far more strategically important than most people currently realize. That is where this conversation starts becoming much bigger than crypto itself, because now the issue is no longer simply whether digital finance grows. The issue may eventually become who controls the infrastructure the world's liquidity becomes trapped inside, and whether global finance eventually becomes more interoperable or more fragmented than ever before. And in the next episode, we're going to break down the next layer almost nobody is asking yet. Because if fragmented financial systems continue emerging globally, then the next major problem may no longer be infrastructure adoption alone. The next major problem may become what happens when liquidity itself starts becoming trapped across competing financial systems simultaneously, why fragmentation pressure may intensify much faster than most people expect, and why that environment could eventually change the bridge asset conversation entirely.